Hey there, PyroMonkey crew, and welcome to another video tutorial. Today we're going to be talking about a new / old way to paint black. Something that I want to talk about really quickly, as we are getting into this is, like I said before, this is also an old way to paint black. This is the way that a lot of the old masters would actually paint black. And the way that they would do it is by glazing complementary colors, right? So they would glaze magentas or reds and then greens over those, or blues and kind of like orange or browns, like a burnt sienna. And what that had the effect of doing is having a subtractive effect on the color, meaning that eventually if you glaze these complements over each other enough times, it's going to shift to black, which is really great because visually you get a much more interesting black than you would normally just by using your normal black paint. And what color information you're receiving back from this kind of subtractive method of glazing these complementary colors is much more interesting because some color is escaping back, and the color that isn't escaping feels much darker and much more rich than just that kind of charcoal black that we normally use. And I think that if you've ever been to an art gallery or an art museum and you've seen those really rich blacks, you understand what I'm saying. And if you haven't, I would highly suggest that you go check that kind of stuff out. The colors we're going to be using here are Nightmare Blue from Reaper, Golden's Burnt Sienna, Chimera's Magenta, and Golden's Green. You could easily swap any of these colors out with any of the Reaper Clears, and any of the golden colors for Chimera, and any of the Chimera colors for Golden. Now that I've kind of given you a little bit of a brief overview here, we're going to hop in and we are going to start glazing. The first color that I'm going to put down here is Nightmare Blue, and really all it is it's a phthalo blue. It's a phthalo blue. I think it has a touch of black in it. So yeah, we're just going to continue to put this color down. So one thing that I hope that you're getting from this is that it's a very easy process. It's a very messy process. You don't have to be very tight or very controlled or very neat, especially if this is like one of the first things that you're doing. And a lot of that's because all we're doing essentially is washing these colors on over and over and over again. So, I mean, if you're an absolute beginner, you could do this. I showed my wife this video and she actually did it herself and had great results. So this next color that we are putting on, the second layer, is going to be Burnt Sienna from Golden. And again, absolutely fantastic color. And again, you're seeing here, I don't have to be super controlled. And that a lot of that is because we're just kind of washing, glazing, tinting, whatever word you want to use here over this previous color. Something that, I'm sure some of you are seeing though, is that the process, it looks a little bit weird. At least at first, it just kind of looks like this messy kind of splattering of colors. And what I found with a lot of these glazing processes is that you really have to trust the process. Here in, once we get this round of 4 colors done and we start on the next one, you're going to start to see a much more significant darkening. And then once we hit that third round of it, it really goes dark, like really black dark. Now, if you miss a part of the model while you're going through this process, don't worry about it. Just hit that area and just kind of keep going with the process. You don't need to backtrack, anything like that, to slow you down. And what we're doing here is we're coming in with that phthalo green. Again, just kind of washing, tinting. You can tell that when we do it this first time around, the color that we put on top of everything has a lot more influence. And again, this is why I'm putting such an emphasis on trusting the process, because it just looks really weird for the first few times. I have no problems admitting that. Something else too, just to touch on here, when you do this process in terms of your priming, I would highly recommend a zenithal priming and making sure that you really get a lot of white onto it. And I know it'll sound kind of paradoxical, but when you have a white as a base coat and you're painting the specific kind of black, which is that subtractive glazing black, then what happens is that white underneath sends a little bit more color information back to the eye, because the way that I like to explain is like the light has to filter through a bunch of teeny tiny little panes of tinted glass, and then it hits if it was a black background, not much light would come back to you through that glass. But if you had a big white board that was very bright and that light hit, it would send back a little bit more. It definitely has a different feeling to the eye than, if it was darker or even a mid-tone. And you'll kind of see what I'm talking about as we go and as we filter more and more and more of this. And coming in here with the magenta, you can kind of see we're starting to get a bit of a darkening effect. It's starting to finally shift down. And again, we're only in the first phase. I personally love how all the colors kind of intermingle. It's satisfying in some way, shape, or form. I think it's the combination of all of the complementaries. So something else too on top of this is that we're not going to be using a lot of flat paint. This technique works best with anywhere from like a satin to a gloss kind of texture of paint. And that's largely because the more of a sheen the paint has, the more color depth you get, and so the darker the paint feels. And so the more flat and the more matte the paint is, the less dark it's going to feel. So yeah, and from this point, we're really just going to repeat the process, right? We're coming back in with our blue, and we're just going to go back over the entire shield one more time with each of these complementary tones. When I first found out about this, I really heavily doubted that it would work. And then I've done it a few times, leading up to this. And each time, even doing it with you can do it with two complementaries. I opted to use 4 just because I found out that it canceled out and it shifted black a lot faster. And I was also, painting this model, which it's one of the chaos models. It has a lot of iconography to 4 different chaos gods. And so I thought that it would be fun to kind of integrate that into the way that I was painting the black. It's kind of a little bit of a storytelling thing there for me, but you can do it with 2 colors. Like you can do it with ultramarine and burnt sienna or phthalo blue and burnt sienna, and it works just the same. I think you would just find that it takes longer. It takes maybe 2 times as many, rounds of back and forth to really get a very solid black. It's a they're very satisfying blacks still. But again, it's just longer. Talking about longer, in this video, I think you can see this whole process takes about, 15-ish minutes, before all the edits. And what I would compare this to is if you were painting like a Sigmarine like I have here, the process should only take between 15 to 20 minutes if you're kind of chugging along, if you're really focused. And so for some people that may be too long. For other people, it may not be. If I was going to paint up a nice little set of figures with black armor, I would spend the time. But that being said, this technique may not be for everybody who's trying to just knock out a black. If you're just really trying to hammer it out, I mean, by all means, use some black. You can actually, even like dry brush the model with a gray and do this over that black base coat after the fact and still get some of that interest going. But it's entirely up to you. All of these processes are entirely up to you. Take what you will of them. It's just kind of new fun things that I'm finding out and experimenting with, and I love sharing that with you guys. And again, you can see here we're coming back with like the second round of magenta, and it's much, much darker even than the first. And it's interesting too to me because there is an aspect of visual confusion that starts to happen where your eye your eye kind of has a 404 like page not found kind of thing going on where it has a hard time interpreting what it's seeing. And so if you kind of try to focus on one area, you can kind of pick out a color, but it's hard to focus on that area because there's a lot going on. And what your eye tells you is like, hey, this is dark. It's dark and it's more interesting than, something painted with a black pigment, but it's hard to grasp onto exactly what it is. And here we are starting our third round. Once you get it to a certain point as well, like let's say you get to the end of your second round and you're like, okay, this is dark. What I found is if I switched over to just like a dual complementary, and in this case it was this Nightmare Blue and Burnt Sienna, I could just kind of go back and forth with those two a couple of times, and it would really finish off getting it to the point of darkness that I needed it to. Blue is naturally the darkest color on the color wheel. I think I've talked about this a few times. I think it just helps with that darkening process. If you have more questions too about that subject on color brightness and you want me to make a video on it, let me know in the comments. There's so many of these like little topics that can be broken down into individual pieces. I love talking about all of them. I love color theory and trying to make it digestible for everybody. I think that understanding the kind of inner workings of how and why things work really helps us create like beautiful things for other people to enjoy. So yeah, just taking a look here, we did it took us 2 rounds, and then we did 1 final glaze of blue and 1 final glaze of brown, and it turned out just quite lovely. Again, you can still see a variety of colors in the black, and it's hard to pin down one specifically, but they're there, and the eye feels that difference. And so, again, just comparing it to the Sigmarine, you know, again, this process should only take like 15-20 minutes per 32 mil if you're wanting to paint a kick-ass black. That's what I would recommend. Thank you guys all so much for your support. If you enjoyed this free content or any of my other free content, please hit that subscribe button. And also, if you want to support me monthly, you can head over to my Patreon. It's $5 a month. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee. You can support me and my family. You guys are great. So happy and proud to be a part of this community. Pyromonkey Painting, signing off.